moment anthropology has ever had, I think, and still to this day is actually an important thing to understand about people, is that what we learn to do socially, culturally, inherit and learned behavior is much more important than our sort of inherited racial biology or genetics or whatever we want to talk about that. And that's somewhat, in some ways, that translates, or one of the things that anthropologists, one of the reasons anthropologists use to argue for this is that people could have very similar physical appearance. You know, they could be classified as the same race phenotypically, but might have hugely different cultural characteristics, language, history, food, all those things. So the people who we classify as white or black or Asian might have super different cultures and cultural characteristics, or we might say ethnicities. And true that anthropology was trying to say that culture, this stuff that we call culture, is the way that we become human, that it's dynamic and yes, changing all the time, and opens our lives up to multiple possibilities, that we could have lived a different life if we'd been raised somewhere else, or could still live a different life if we decided to take one on. Now, that's not to say we can't get rid of the old life. It'll always be with us because we inherited it, but we can change, and people can change, and cultures and whole societies can change. And that's much more important than this idea that people had that race or their biology or the physical environment was determining of people's lives. Now, oh, right. Because it's against these ideas that we were determined by our biology or genetics. And so I think a couple classes ago, actually, when we first discussed this, I think Shaylin asked me if this was an anti-racist idea. I think now that I'm thinking about it, I probably said yes at the time, but now that I've wrapped this around in my mind, I don't think it was necessarily an anti-racist idea. I mean, it was, but that's kind of a modern term. That's in our terms. It's really a term against the determination of race. And you could use it if you employed it into an anti-racist project, but that's more of a political project than the academic project was simply trying to explain people's thoughts and behaviors and differences and get beyond the idea that those were determined by your race. Now, the way that this was popularly taken up in the world was not exactly how anthropologists intended it to be, although they didn't protest as much as they probably should have. And the popular take on this was to say, oh, yeah, great. Thank you, anthropology. Cultures are these things that everybody has. And in the popular kind of appropriation, or the way people took this in, they became kind of a something that you had, something that was determining of your thoughts and behavior. So we would say things like, well, that's your culture, or that's their culture, that's why they are like that. And it became something that was unchanging, bounded, and static. And in this sense, you'll notice that in the popular take, culture becomes very much like what we used to think of as race. You've just swapped your terms around a little bit. So if you've lost the dynamism and the change and the multiple possibilities. And in part, or in some ways, people began to say, oh, great. So what we should do is start using ethnic terms, or the terms of ethnicity, rather than race terms. And so, again, anthropology was trying to do something in the world to get us out of our locked-in thinking about race, but whether that worked or not is sort of debatable. Now, we might turn to our friends, the white people. White people don't, in general, I don't think white people like to be called white people. Usually, sometimes when I ask people what race they consider themselves to be, what's a term that white people like better than white people? Caucasian. Yeah. So you're gonna say, Kat?
I was more going to say that that's not even really accurate. That Caucasian people would be from the Caucasus Mountains, and that's not really.
That's like an Asia.
Yeah, let's talk about this a little bit. A lot of people raise their hand or they'll fill out a form and they'll say, I'm Caucasian. And it always makes me laugh. And it's actually even worse than making me laugh. It's kind of bad. And it has that scientific sound, right? It's got a few more syllables in it. It sounds like it might be related to something else. Caucasian, but absolutely correct. The term Caucasian comes to us from the Caucasus, these mountains here, around here, sort of northeast of Turkey, in this region of the world. And you might wonder, what the hell are white people calling themselves Caucasian for? Well, it turns out that this guy named Blumenthal went to the Caucasus and I don't know, maybe he fell in love there. I don't know what happened, but he became convinced that this was like the location of the Garden of Eden and where God had created the original people. And so that white people should be called Caucasians and that other people were kind of derivative of that and had fallen from this. So when you use the term Caucasian, it's like super pseudoscience. It's not science at all. It's going back into like creationism and who Blumenthal was in love with. And this area of the world, which in today's world, the people from this area of the world, from Georgia and the Caucasus, are actually a multi-ethnic group. A lot of them belong to are Islamic or practice Muslim, but it's multi-ethnic. So in some ways, they're in your census form, they'd be included in the white category in the United States for reasons that we'll talk about. But some people would get in the United States wouldn't even necessarily, they'd be like, I don't know about those people. So anyway, be careful of the term Caucasian. It's a funny one. So ethnicity instead of race. Now, some anthropologists did sort of support this. They would say things, and I think some of you wrote this on your race field work. They would say, well, we know that race isn't biologically real. We did that in the last class, and so we won't do that again. But race isn't biologically real. It doesn't correspond to something out there, genetically or biologically speaking, but ethnicity is real. It's this shared culture and history, and so that's real. So if we wanted to have a term for white people, what might we be able to bring in here instead of Caucasian that we might, throw in? Yeah. European American. So some anthropologists have said that, yeah, we should just adopt this term instead, European Americans. And so, we don't have to talk about white people, we can talk about European Americans. What do you think, Shaylin? If we just start calling people European Americans, would that be a great idea? That help us out with our we start using ethnic terms instead of race terms. Will we all be happier? Probably not. What are we avoiding by calling people European Americans instead of whites? And this you did write about. This wasn't something we talked about. What are we avoiding if we start using these kinds of terms? What are we not talking about? Yeah.
Well, I have a friend from Turkey who lives in the Anatolian side, and he considers himself white, even though he's not actually from Europe. So I think it's kind of weird to say just Europeans can be considered white.
Yeah, we'll talk about this. If you look at your census form and you look at all the things that you could write in as white, and we'll talk about why exactly that happened, that people from Turkey are indeed encouraged to identify as white in the United States. So it would not be actually inclusive of all the people who fall into the white category, But I'm just thinking now that it's a pretty problematic euphemism because it avoids talking about the racism that potentially was a formation or part of the formation of these categories. And so it makes it sound like a bunch of European Americans showed up and a bunch of African Americans showed up, and maybe there were some Native Americans here, and we just all happened to be from these different places. You know, this wonderful place where we got all these people together. And so it hides any sort of power dynamic between them. And it also lets us avoid this topic of whiteness, which we wanted to talk about last class, remember? We're all excited to talk about whiteness and the category of whiteness. What did we learn about the category of whiteness? Yeah.
We
Talked about white privilege, that's true. Well, what about this category of whiteness? Even by saying whiteness, it sounds kind of mean, right? You're like, woo, yeah.
So in South America.
Yeah, we did talk about people trying to get to there from different places. Yeah.
I wrote down that it was like defined by like what people are not and like who is not white rather than like having an actual like substance.
Yeah, I mean, so it's often defined by who's excluded from that. But it's like, see, the very fact that we're naming this as a category, whiteness, is kind of radical, because for the most part, you want to, if you're in this category, you want to remain unnamed, you want to remain unmarked. So it's the difference between having a marked category and having an unmarked category, one that is seen as just the natural or the default. So traditionally in this country, whiteness is just something that is kind of, you know, kind of go under the radar. You say you're a Caucasian, get by, keep yourself unmarked. Because being unmarked means you're not ethnic, right? So most people who fall into the whiteness category, the closest they get to ethnicity is maybe a little bit of garlic in their food or something like that. But for the most part, it's like, you know, they're not going to touch ethnicity. You don't want to start being ethnic. That's for other people. So anyway, basically the idea that we can use ethnic terms as a substitute, especially in this country for race, is kind of weird. Now, some people believe that ethnicity is equivalent to national identity. So we have this idea that there's this place over there called Italy, and Italy is full of Italians, top to bottom. Or there's a place like France, and France is full of French people all over the place. Now, I'll talk about this for a second. Anthropologists usually haven't been in favor of this idea. Some people do still believe it. And in part, it has to do with how we encounter people from other countries in the United States. We might ask them where they're from, and wherever they're from, we say, oh, you're that. And we just lump them all together. For those of you who come from the Italian category, on this map, do you know the two groups of people who hate each other the most? Yeah. Well, Northern Italians and Southern Italians. What my grandparents used to call the Bassa Italia, the lower Italians. And we were from the North. And the worst thing you could do in the world, our world, was marry somebody from Southern Italy. You could marry somebody from all over the place. It didn't matter. But that would be like treason, man. That would be terrible. You're gonna blow my mind. I'm ready. Grandparents, parents.
Are both from North and Southern. So you got Sicily and I believe Genoa. So
Genoa, well, oh, it depends. If you're doing Sicily and Genoa, you haven't made it up to Northern Italy yet. You're fine. You're still down here. You're below Rome.
Yeah. It's Southern or Northern Italian, just whether or not you're above or below Rome, basically.
This is kind of the line, although it's more like here and here, you know. But there were people would meet in the United States and they would marry each other. One of my grandparents' friends did marry someone from Boss Italia and said, "Don't ever tell my relatives I did that." But when I looked in her eyes, they were just so. But yeah, I was always told as a kid that the people from here, well, as we learned in the last class, that their skin got too dark in the summertime, and so that they might have mixed with people from other parts of the world that, I mean, these people up here are pretty racist. Anyway.
Again, it feels kind of weird to label white as just European, because Southern Italians are very much European, like just as much as North Italians.
Yeah, well, like I said, we're getting there. Don't worry. So, if ethnicity is not equivalent to nation, more anthropologists would say that so this is a country in Africa, Nigeria, right? And so sometimes when we'd meet people from Nigeria in this country, would say, "Oh, you're Nigerian." But anthropologists would be more likely to say, "Oh, no, there's like lots of different ethnic groups in Nigeria." And so you can look online and you can find another map of Nigeria, which kind of divides it up into these and this is in some ways equally wrong, but it's the idea that these different ethnic groups occupy parts of the country of Nigeria. Now, there were good reasons for saying this because a lot of these became, people who were oppressed. And so some anthropologists and others would want these people to have rights and protection, like the Tiv or some group that anthropologists were studying. But there is another advantage to anthropology to say that the nation of Nigeria has this many ethnic groups. Let's put it to you this way. If there's only Nigerians in Nigeria, how many anthropologists do you need to go study them? I'm going to go study the Nigerians. You only need one. Well, if there's a bunch of ethnic groups, I can get somebody to go study the Tiv and go study who are up here, the Hausa and the Fulani. I can send out all kinds of good anthropologists, get some money. Study them. Yeah, I can get more people there. So you might be wondering, what the heck then does anthropology have to say about ethnicity? What are the insights that we can have? Tiana, what do we learn about ethnicity?
Well, one thing is that it can be voluntary, and you can claim like multiple ethnicities.
Yeah, so basically, one of the big insights of anthropology is it's not this sort of primordial thing that is like it's something. The categories of ethnicity, for the most part, were invented in the last 300 to 500 years. So they're not very old. People often claim different ones or mix them up. And in some ways, well, Kat, what do we learn also about ethnicity and where people are in different situations? What can you do with ethnicity? Let us say you're from Jamaica.
I was trying to say that well, even on this worksheet, it has it listed under Black or African American. But the problem is Jamaican isn't really an ethnicity, it's a nationality, because you could go to Jamaica and you can find a person that looks 100% ethnically Chinese and they're speaking like full patois to you, and it's going to be the same for anybody else. So you can't really see two different people and be like, oh, that person's not Jamaican, because they could be.
They could be. Yeah, so one of the other insights of anthropology is that ethnicity is something that is situational. It's not necessarily something that people call to mind every day. Sometimes they might use a category like nation, sometimes they might use a category that's more like what you might consider culture, or sometimes more like race, and it can shift according to where you are in the world. Like race, in some ways, ethnicity is often defined against people that you don't want to be. So people don't always think about who they are, they think about who they don't like, and they distinguish themselves from them. The other thing we learn about ethnicity is that a lot of times, several of you quoted that it's not necessarily something that people think about all the time. It's not necessarily something that is called to mind every day. There are people that Guest calls identity entrepreneurs, who are in some ways profiting from selling ethnicity. So you might sell ethnic bumper stickers, or, or try to get elected based on your ethnicity, or stir up ethnic passions in order to support a certain cause. Yes.
I know right now, there's someone running who is queer, and this kind of using that as his driving point.
Yeah, and so I mean, like all identities, these things can get called up and made powerful at different times. And it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just we have to be aware that people often are trying to use it in a certain way. Could be good, don't know. But you just have to be aware of that. We'll talk about this in a second, that in some ways, the nation state often came before this idea of ethnicity. Most people think of it as the other way around, but like I said, we'll talk about it in a little bit. And then another insight from anthropology. Alex, what's happening with globalization to the idea of ethnicity, national identity? What would you say?
So I said, while I use the code in many parts of the world, we see an intensification of ethnic and national identities in relation to conflict. And then I said ethnicity seems to become a form of nationalism when it involves politics or like power conflicts.
Yeah, absolutely. So in some ways, we thought there was a time when we thought that if everybody just kind of moved around and talked to each other, that things like ethnicity would go away. And it's kind of been the opposite of that, exacerbate. I should have used the word intensify. That in some ways, the fact that we are moving around and talking to different people tend to, in some ways, really play up the idea of ethnicity. So these are some, I think, some pretty huge insights that you can take from anthropology about ethnicity. And I was happy of those of you who read through the chapter and developed your sense of what ethnicity was. We might ask ourselves, though, to what extent have these insights from anthropology been accepted out there in the world? How great have we done it? What, Amy, you're shaking your head like this. The world just doesn't agree with this. The general opinion out there in the world has been, whatever, anthropology, you guys do your thing, we'll do our thing. And there's, I think, a number of reasons for that. We want to tell people that ethnicity isn't this primordial thing that you have, but other people want to sell it. They want to sell you something that's based on authentic ethnicity. And so, they're not into people telling them that ethnicity might be a social construction because it's big money. Also, I mean, this is one of the saddest things that we've seen. The people in Yugoslavia basically lived, kind of in harmony for many, many years. And then the identity entrepreneurs got in there and convinced certain people that their religion or their ethnic identification was more important, and people tore neighborhoods apart. People started fighting each other that had never fought each other. And so, this has been quite terrible in the world, is that, various ethnic conflicts have been revved up in places where they weren't before. Also, some people love when such things arise, they love saying, oh yeah, those people have always hated each other. So in Guest, he gives the example of Rwanda. And there was a terrible, awful Rwandan genocide, between groups that are identified as the Hutu and the Tutsi, if I'm not mistaken. But the thing about these groups is before colonialism, before Belgian and German colonialism, those were more like occupational categories. They weren't seen as ethnic categories. And it was the colonial governments which encouraged this kind of ethnic identification, which then years later became this huge conflict. So it's very convenient sometimes for places like the former colonizers to say, we have nothing to do with this. They've always hated each other. When in fact, many of these colonial countries had a role in doing this. Another way in which this happens is it was before your time, but we used to be in this conflict with the Soviet Union called the Cold War, capitalism versus communism. And for us, it was a Cold War because we never fought directly. But in many places, in other parts of the world, like in Africa, like in Latin America, the United States would arm one side in favor of what we called capitalism, and the Soviet Union would arm another side in favor of what they called communism. But now the Cold War is over. Now we all are doing other things. And a lot of these groups continue to have arms. And so now we often say, oh yeah, there's these ethnic groups that are at war with each other. They've always been at war with each other, when actually those were funded by a much more recent conflict. We've talked about this a little bit already, so I won't dwell on it, but the idea that a certain ethnicity must be a part of the nation, a lot of the people who once were the default category are trying to mark themselves and go parading around and claiming that we should be an ethnically homogeneous country. This is happening in the United States, and it's happening in various parts of the world, Italy. And I think the other factor here, and one of the reasons why people are inattentive to history these days and the things that some of these things are constructed, is that, at least to me, it seems like our preoccupation with screens and recency and technology has made us less historical than ever before. So, hasn't helped. There are a couple things that I would like you to watch out for, or I think ways in which anthropology has been wrongly appropriated. And I know this sounds weird, but I have seen people talk to others or think about others like Native Americans and say, wait, I learned from an anthropology class that you're just a recently invented ethnicity, so you shouldn't get to have rights here. Or, well, wait, I learned in anthropology there's no such thing as race, so why do we need Black Lives Matter? That's racist. Just watch out. Don't take that lesson from us. So, what should you learn? Both race and ethnicity are socially constructed categories, that they are not given in nature. People, of course, are biologically varied in all kinds of different ways, but that doesn't link you automatically to a specific race or ethnicity. Those categories have shifted over time, and many of them have been created or enhanced or emerged within the last 500 years, within the time span of European colonialism. Now, in a traditional world, if you were marked as not part of the white category or as being ethnic, it usually meant you were being excluded or oppressed. That's been traditionally the case. And in many cases, I would say that's still the case. It's not, it's not like this is being marked as non-white is necessarily helpful, but traditionally it's been, again, a category of exclusion. At the same time, people sometimes organize around these categories or appropriate them in order to combat oppression. So in some ways, we might say that the Black Lives Matter movement does depend upon organization around a category in order to fight police brutality. And so when people are using these categories in order to fight back against in ways that they've been traditionally oppressed, we have to be careful about our throwing around our anthropological terms like social construction, race isn't real, etc. We can do it. We can make it. So ethnicity will still be on our minds, right? The idea of where you come from, what values you share, and how it's been, in some cases, valued, in some cases not, in the construction of various nations. So for nation states, I want to start with a quote. I looked up how to try to pronounce this person's name. Yeah, it gets really hard really fast for those of us who don't speak Italian.
Your ancestors were pretty brave.
My ancestors didn't speak Italian, but they were from what we know of as Italy, which is a clue to what Massimo d'Aciello was saying, which is in 1861, he made the declaration that we have made Italy, now we must make Italians. What do you think he meant by that? We have made Italy, now we must make Italians. Yes.
Well, before the 1860s, Italy was actually a bunch of different countries, such as Parma, Venice, Milan, Sicily, Naples. There was a bunch of them. The Papal States, even the Pope was its own country at one point. And until that time, there wasn't really this idea of Italian. It was more based on region. So a bunch of political leaders in the mid-19th century sort of came along and said, we should all be united and call ourselves Italian, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it started with a political project to unify these regions that didn't speak the same language.
It was the same with Germany.
Didn't
Germany
it?
was
Yeah.
hundreds of different countries. It wasn't just a handful like Italy was.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was, so what he's saying is we made it, we got rid of those little places, and now we're one state, we're one country, but we don't have Italian identity. And so, like I said, this is the opposite to what most people think of national identity comes from. Most people think you have this identity and then you become a nation. It actually is, in most cases, the opposite. Now, when we're reading the kinship chapter, guest also discussed this with ideas about kinship and the nation state and drawing on the important work of Benedict Anderson, who talked about this as who talked about the nation as an imagined community. And what this means is that we once thought that things like kinship and family were going to fade out as identifiers. But in fact, the metaphors of kin, nation, or kinship and blood and relatedness kind of get translated into this big sphere. And what he means by imagined community is that people that have never met each other and may live very far away, not 20 minutes away like Alex and Paige, but very far away and don't share almost anything they're perhaps in common, can nevertheless imagine themselves to be part of the same community. And if you think about this, this is kind of crazy. Like the idea that I might get on a plane with somebody from California and somebody from Texas, and we're gonna fly to some country in the Middle East and we're gonna risk our lives for a country? Like, what do I have in common with these Californians and Texans and North Carolinians and stuff? Like, what do I really share with them, and why I'm about to die for a country? Like, people would think this was crazy 300 years ago, that you die for a country or kill somebody for your country. Again, I don't have any, I'm not down on anybody who's in the military, but this is kind of a whack idea, right? That you would feel such kinship with people from far away that you're willing to go do something to help them out. So how do we make Italians? How do we make these Italians? This was often modeled, as Guest describes, the people who really did this well the first time perhaps were the French. And so people kind of emulated the French model for how you make people into whatever nationality you want to. And a lot of it has to do with standardizing the school system. So for example, at the time of the French Revolution, the majority of the population in what is now France did not speak what we would call French. And so what they did was, you choose one dialect, Italy, the dialect that was probably spoken around Tuscany, and you say, wait, that's French. This is going to be standard French, and if you're speaking something else, we're not going to go for that anymore. Get hit. Also in school, you learn this sense of history. Draw a border around yourself, and then you start studying French history or Italian history or whatever history you have. Any of you have to take US history? Yeah, it's the idea that we have to take the history and we all learn about a common thing that's going on. One of the things that Benedict Anderson and others argued is that schools give us literacy, the ability to read, and especially in the old days, before all these screens came out, we all got a newspaper. And so we'd all be reading the same thing. We'd literally be on the same page, and we could all talk about the same thing, a shared set of facts, which we all thought were important in our country, even if we hadn't met each other. So this is one of the huge ways in which you take people from varying backgrounds, you put them into school and you standardize things, and you try to give them this sense of a national identity. Another good way to do this is to put people into the military. And so in Italy, for example, and some other countries, military service is compulsory for a couple of years, or was. And what you do is you take those Southern Italians and you put them together with Northern Italians, and then you move them back and forth and all around, and you create this sense that you're all into this together. This helps with something else, Shaylin. What helps if we have an army? What might we do? Who are we looking for? Well, I'm part of the military. Who am I looking for? What am I looking to do? Yeah, I mean, it gives us a sense that we're fighting. You know, there might be an enemy out there. We might not be looking for it, but we're ready. We have a common external enemy, which gives me a sense that, you know, I'm part of this thing against those people out there. So it has it's a great way to inculcate national identity. In part, this happened in our own country during World War II. Throw people together from different regions and send them off to fight against other people gives you a good sense. There's a number of other things that people do. They build connecting roads and railways. When I was doing my field work in Colombia, I learned that in the early days of Colombia, almost all the railroads were from the mountains out to the coast, and they didn't connect to the inside because they were basically trying to export things out. And so it was really hard to get from one part of the country to another. It was really easy to get out of the country. It was hard to get between different places in the country. So that's one of the things you want to do, is build these connecting things so that people can feel like they're in the same country. Then you change the roads when you're crossing a border to make sure everybody knows. There's other things that people do, like standardize the food, cookbooks that tell you what a certain type of food is. You gotta get your national anthem together, start doing a festival, Independence Day, music, all of these things. So these are things that people use. Again, most people believe that these things precede the country or precede the nation, and the nation is built from these things. Whereas in most cases, the nation or the state precedes or comes before these things, which are then inculcated and celebrated so that we can make people into French people or make them into Italians. So, in what I would call traditional nation building, your national identity, it might be in certain cases, for example, when we talk about the dialect that was around Paris or the dialect that was around Tuscany, you might link certain things to a specific identity, but usually it's more kind of free floating out there. It's like a blend of various things. And so when you're building this nation, what you're trying to do is create this community. It's kind of like creating this sense of kin, or kind of like an ethnicity, but don't want to get too serious about that. But it's, it's this imagined national community that's kind of like an ethnic group. And traditionally, that kind of nation building, if you wanted to, if you weren't really a part of that, then you became a minority. You became what were termed ethnic minorities. And so kind of like the category of whiteness is a default category or an unmarked category, there are these other groups that would be marked as being ethnic and not fully part of the national identity. Now, in the United States, we kind of have done this in various ways. And I want to go back to something that we were supposed to talk in the last chapter of Guest, which is what did we do from the 1840s with people who identified as Irish or as Italian, people from Greece or people from Eastern Europe? These people were not, when they first immigrated, were not considered to be fully white. In fact, there was a lot of anti-Irish sentiment, anti-Italian sentiment, etc. Cat. Yeah.
Like Irish people, they were basically like completely eliminated from even getting jobs. Like places of work would like post Irish need not apply. Eastern European, there was a lot of like trying to enforce like only English, but I guess that's the case for all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was wrong with there's something that some of these groups, what was wrong, especially with the Irish and the Italians? Yeah.
Well, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, that, traditionally, people like to consider white people European, but they're all European.
They're all European. So what's wrong with them? Why were they looked down upon and seen as not as good as being?
Well, I don't really know about the Irish, but I know that, like, as I was saying about like Italians, Greeks, I guess the same would apply to people from like Spain or Portugal, because they had a more Mediterranean kind of appearance that was sort of used to justify saying that they were not white.
Yeah, there's that swarthiness, the skin. Yeah, what else?
The thing is that at that time period, like to be white in America, you were also mostly Protestant, and people from like Ireland and Italy at the time were mostly Catholics.
Catholics, yeah. Being Catholic was a huge issue. And it actually was for up until, might still be an issue. But yeah, they were seen as, as perhaps being more, having more allegiance to Rome than to their country. And so being Catholic came with other things, like people accused them of having too many kids. Ever heard that one about people, right? This is still being used today against certain migrants. They had their families were too big, that they were given to crime. People were accused, Italians, of being enmeshed in crime. And garlic in general was seen as just a little too ethnic, And have you ever watched It's a Wonderful Life? Wait, you don't watch It's a Wonderful Life? Oh my gosh, okay. It used to be on every Thanksgiving, where he talks about that wonderful town, and he tells them that you don't want to be down with the garlic eaters. And he's talking about the Italians, right? They're too ethnic. So what do we do with them? And then actually, one of the other groups that got incorporated, it was the Armenians, who, if you saw our map, they were out there by the Caucasus, getting pretty far east. And a lot of people considered the Armenians to be, some people labeled them as Asiatic Turks, which wouldn't be considered white. But there was some fairly significant Supreme Court cases, and people were able to naturalize as white, including the Armenians. And so basically these groups, although they were initially discriminated against, basically got thrown into the white melting pot. They're like, yeah, that'll do. That's good enough. You're good. You'll be in the white category. And so these groups were successfully able to, and again, a lot of this played out in the courts, but for the most part, the court included them in the definition of being white and able to naturalize as white, because you could only naturalize as either white or black. Now, into this situation steps Takao Ozawa, who was of Japanese descent, but had basically grown up in the United States, wanted to naturalize, takes his case to the Supreme Court, and he makes a couple of arguments. He says, first of all, my skin is as white as any of yours, because, he's fairly light-skinned. But he also said it shouldn't matter, that he wrote his own brief, and he said that he was, was basically, at heart an American, and that is what should matter. It should not matter what race he was assigned to. The Supreme Court said no. If you are Japanese, you are not white, and you cannot naturalize. So it refused that case. The next case, a few months after, was brought by Bhagat Singh Thind, and this one is actually discussed in Guests on page 185. And this also went to the Supreme Court, and Bhagat Singh Thind kind of looked at what had happened with Ozawa, and he said, all right, fine. I'm Indian, but I'm of the Aryan race. And he actually said, I'm Caucasian. And so he was trying to do this, he was trying to do the science, and in fact, the Supreme Court agreed. They said, well, yeah, I guess you are Aryan, I guess you are Caucasian, but you aren't white, as would be defined by the common white man. Bhagat Singh Thind also lost his case, was unable to naturalize. And so basically the Supreme Court in 1922 said that Asians, basically starting at around India or Pakistan, if you got all the way over to there, but around there, and anything east of that, then you don't get to be in the melting pot. And like I said, this was decided by the Supreme Court. It led to other immigration restrictions, the Asian Exclusion Act, and in some ways it probably set the stage for the internment camps of the Japanese in World War II. I mean, the fact that the United States was able to see the Japanese both not just as an external enemy, but to take citizens who had been born in this country and to put them in these camps. I mean, we didn't do that with the Germans, who we were also fighting, but it was seen as acceptable for the Japanese. And so again, actually, if you look at your census categories and what the way those boxes are lined up on the race thing, you'll notice that the Supreme Court decisions are still kind of shaping the way that we think about race today. So this we already talked about, but I just want to set it up because, as I said, in the next class, I want to talk about nationalism. So we've talked about how national identity is often this kind of not free-floating, but a bit of a mix of or amalgam of things, which is encouraged by the nation state, and that those who are deemed to be left out of it, there's often a kind of melting pot that happens, but there's others who are deemed to be not part of that, and they get excluded or become labeled as ethnic minorities. Now, if you think about this, you might just think about what would you expect nationalism then to be? What is it that nationalism would be based on this definition of, or what we've just heard about nation building? What then would constitute nationalism, or what would we expect it to be? Actually, though, let's think about that. But let's look at those census forms a little bit. This is from 2020. As we were talking about at the beginning of class, everybody who is in the United States during 2020, citizen or not, we try to get you to fill out this form, or someone will come and ask you these questions. And every person is asked both question 6, Hispanic origin, and question 7, race. Don't get to skip. You have to do both. For this census, Hispanic origins are not races. Now, what does it say about our country? Why are we asking this question? Why is the United States hung up on this question? Why do we have to ask this of everybody? I mean, we only ask them a few other things. We don't even ask them how much money they have, but we do want to know this. What do you think, Shaylin? What does it say about us?
I mean, I don't know, I just think it's interesting that like every time it's like, oh, it's for demographics and it's for us to, keep track of all these, I don't know, they kind of present it in a different way than I'm guessing they're using it.
Oh, yeah, and actually, I'm not trying to argue. I'm not saying we shouldn't use this. I'm just asking, like, what does it say about us that we're fixated on this question? Why are we wrapped up with this one? Yeah, Kat.
I think it might be like just the kind of idea that like some Americans have about like Hispanic people, but I feel like usually particularly excluding Spain.
Yeah, it's interesting. Usually when people say Hispanic, it doesn't mean Spain. And it's interesting that in this census, if you're Spanish, if you're from Spain, you also have to you have to write in like Spaniard. Whereas we're usually not that. We're not actually concerned about Spaniards. We're concerned about Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. And it's because, in some ways, one, it's not usually part of the traditional US race categories, for one thing. We're confused by this. The traditional race categories in the United States are white, black. So we're like, know what we're saying. Hispanic origins are not racist. A lot of people want to say that that's race, but the census says no. So it's kind of confused. And then if you think about this, these first three categories, it's actually sorted in demographic order. Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban are the three largest Spanish-speaking groups or Spanish origin groups in the United States. With all of these groups, we have had in the United States a colonial relationship. Mexico, you may remember, but we got 8 of our states from Mexico. Puerto Rico, that's a territory of the United States. It's never been independent. It was part of Spain, and then we got it. And Cuba too, actually, the United States once held Cuba and administered Cuba for 20 years or so. And so we have had a colonial relationship with these three countries, which in part explains why there are more people here. But we're also just hung up on that. As we talked about, the category of being white has expanded significantly from the early days. Ben Franklin didn't like the Germans in Pennsylvania. He was convinced that they were bad and that they weren't assimilating, but now they get to be white. The Irish were ambiguous. These guys were probably mostly white. The Italians were ambiguous. And then these are a couple of interesting categories for inclusion in white. In fact, when I was one of the people who did follow-up in the census in the year 2000, it was the first year that you could write in a race, and it was also the first year that you could check off more than one race. It used to be you could only check off one, and it was basically what the person thought you were. One of the first people I talked to said, when I asked what her race was, she said, well, they say I'm white, but I don't believe them. Didn't really know what to do, but she said, well, I'm Egyptian. And she actually asked that I write that in the bottom as other race, which was interesting. But in this census, we are encouraged to include people, Egyptian people, explicitly as white. Black or African American. Again, these have been the two primary categories in the US Census, and American Indian or Alaska Native, and you can do your group. Yeah.
I have a question. What if you didn't know your ethnic origins?
Yeah, it's interesting that
What do you even write?
we used to not ask this, the ethnic thing. We used to not have the origins. And most of the people, because they got put into the melting pot, would be either more than one or have no idea.
Yeah, you just write American because you're in America. What would you write?
You could. You might not say anything. Might write multiple. Then we get to the boxes. Notice here that these boxes correspond exactly to where the Supreme Court drew the race line. And interestingly, the people in these categories each get a separate race box. Which is really interesting, especially in comparison to the people from Latin America, that, in some ways, I think we're saying that those are powerful countries, and so you get to be your own race if you're from those countries. But by the way, There's one huge country in the Americas that's totally missing from this census. Brazil. Why are they missing?
Because their colony was of Portugal and with
Yeah.
all the other ones, for the most part, were Spanish.
Yeah, I mean, they speak Portuguese. Oh yeah, now we're super confused, and you know, the race stuff, as we talked about, would be confusing. So we don't even have them on here at all. There are also very few Brazilian immigrants to the United States. But the largest country, the other largest country in the Americas is not even on here, which is just interesting. Yeah. Has anybody ever heard of the Chamorro race? No. These last ones are kind of a puzzle. Native Hawaiian, Samoan, and Chamorro. How do we get those? Yeah. Yeah. Not only are they from Polynesia, they're all places the United States owns. So Hawaii is a state, but Native Hawaiians get a box. The Samoans, this is American Samoa. And the people from Guam, who were once a Spanish colony, are also US citizens, but often refer to themselves as Chamorro. And so they get their own box on the census, but it's really the American empire that has set us up like that.